You were taught to believe that Austrian economics is just another political ideology, extreme free market advocacy dressed up as academic theory. That's the lie. And if you're a smart, intellectually honest person who's dismissed Austrian economics based on what you've heard, you've been systematically misled. Here's what's actually true. Ludwig von Mises discovered something that changes everything about how we understand economics. Not a political position, not a preference for markets over government. Something closer to a mathematical proof about the logical structure of human action itself. I know that sounds grandiose. Stay with me for the next 15 minutes, because by the time we're done, you're going to see that what you thought was Austrian bias is actually inescapable logical necessity, and what you thought was mainstream objectivity is actually riddled with hidden assumptions that can't survive scrutiny. You probably encountered Austrian economics in fragments. Maybe a friend who's really into Ron Paul, or a Reddit thread about inflation, or some libertarian think tank promoting sound money. And based on those encounters, you concluded it was political zealotry disguised as scholarship. That's exactly what happened to me for years. I dismissed it without actually understanding it. The problem is this: Austrian economics, particularly Mises' approach, is so fundamentally different from what you learned in college economics that you literally can't understand it to the categories you already have. It's not a different answer to the same questions mainstream economics asks. It's asking completely different questions using a completely different method. And that methodological difference is precisely what makes it so easy to caricature. When someone thinks economics is about statistical models and empirical testing, and you tell them Mises rejected those entirely, they hear, he ignored data and just made stuff up based on ideology. That's myth number one. And we're about to destroy it along with 4 others. But first, let me level with you. If you get this right, if you actually understand what Austrian economics is rather than what people say about it, you'll have a framework for understanding economic reality that no amount of conventional education can provide. Not because Mises had all the answers, because he had the right questions. If you're confused about what Austrian economics actually is, that's completely understandable. The mainstream deliberately obscures it. Universities teach caricatures. Wikipedia gives you warped summaries written by hostile editors. Even many self-proclaimed Austrians misrepresent it as just being pro-capitalism. Here's what I promise you'll discover: 5 specific myths that even intelligent, well-read people believe about Austrian economics. We'll dismantle each one systematically. You'll see direct quotes from Mises that contradict what you've been told he believed. You'll understand the actual praxeological method and why it's not what you think. And by the end, you'll recognize that Austrian economics is something far more radical and rigorous than the cartoon version you dismissed. If you want to discover more about how Mises revolutionized economic thinking, subscribe to this channel where we explore the ideas of thinkers who saw through the illusions that still blind most people today. Let's start with the most common misconception, the one that makes smart, empirically minded people dismiss Austrian economics instantly: the belief that it ignores data and evidence in favor of pure ideology. Here's what people think. Mises sat in his armchair, spun theories out of thin air based on his political preferences, and refused to test them against reality because he was dogmatically attached to free markets. If this were true, dismissing Austrian economics would be completely justified. Here's what's actually true. Mises had a sophisticated epistemological position about the nature of economic science itself. He argued that economics isn't an empirical science like physics, not because he was anti-science, but because the subject matter is fundamentally different. Think about this for a moment. Physics studies objects that don't have purposes, don't choose, don't change their behavior based on understanding. You can run controlled experiments on falling objects because gravity doesn't care what you think about it. But human beings act purposefully. They make choices. They learn. They respond to knowledge. Mises realized this creates an epistemological problem that no amount of statistics can solve. You cannot isolate variables in human action the way you can in a laboratory. Every economic event involves countless purposeful choices interacting in ways that can never be perfectly controlled or repeated. His solution was praxeology, the logic of human action. It starts with one axiom that you literally cannot deny without contradicting yourself. Human beings act purposefully. Try to deny it right now. You can't. Even the attempt to deny it is a purposeful action, which proves the axiom true. From that undeniable starting point, Mises deduced the entire structure of economic theory through pure logic. Action requires means and ends. Means are scarce. Scarcity requires choice. Choice implies value ranking. Multiple people with different value rankings leads to exchange. Exchange requires property. And so on, building an entire logical edifice where every concept necessarily follows from the previous one. Notice what this means. Economic laws discovered this way aren't probably true based on data we've collected so far. They're necessarily true given the nature of human action itself. You can't have a society where inflation increases purchasing power any more than you can have a triangle with four sides. Does this mean Mises ignored history and data? Absolutely not. He was deeply informed by history. But he understood history as illustration of economic principles, not as proof of them. History can show you what happened, but it can't tell you what had to happen given economic law. When Mises predicted that Soviet central planning would fail because economic calculation is impossible without market prices, he wasn't making an empirical prediction like, "I've studied socialist economies and they usually fail." He was stating a logical necessity. Without private property and market prices, rational economic calculation cannot occur. Period. The Soviet Union's collapse 70 years later didn't prove him right. It illustrated what was already necessarily true. You know what's actually anti-empirical? Mainstream economics. When their models fail to predict crises, they don't question the models, they add more variables. When interventionist policies produce the opposite of intended results, they don't question the theory, they blame implementation. That's dogmatism disguised as empiricism. Mises offered something more rigorous, logical proof combined with historical understanding. You can verify his deductions yourself through pure reason, and then you can observe history and see those logical necessities playing out in every economic event that's ever occurred. The myth that Austrian economics ignores evidence is a category error. It's like criticizing mathematics for not running experiments. The discipline is fundamentally different than what critics assume economics should be. So if someone tells you Austrians are anti-empirical ideologues, you now know the truth. They've confused epistemological sophistication with dogmatic stubbornness. Mises wasn't ignoring data. He was recognizing the limits of what data can prove about purposeful human action. Now, let's address the second myth that smart people believe. Austrian economics is just free market advocacy with academic pretensions. It starts with a conclusion, capitalism good, government bad, and works backward to justify that preference. I completely understand why people think this. Most exposure to Austrian economics comes through political channels, libertarian organizations, free market think tanks, financial commentators ranting about the federal. And yes, most people who identify as Austrian economists are indeed pro-capitalism, so the correlation is real. But correlation isn't causation, and you're smarter than assuming it is. Here's what's actually happening. Mises' logical analysis of human action leads inevitably to certain conclusions about economic systems. Not because he preferred those conclusions, because logic is unforgiving. Let me show you how this works. Mises proves through pure logic that economic calculation, the rational allocation of resources to satisfy human wants, requires market prices. Market prices require private property and voluntary exchange. Why? Because you cannot compare the value of different production methods without prices. You cannot have meaningful prices without voluntary exchange. And you cannot have voluntary exchange without property rights. This isn't a political preference. It's a logical necessity derived from the nature of scarcity, choice, and purposeful action. Mises didn't say, "I prefer markets." He said, given the logical structure of human action in conditions of scarcity, rational economic organization requires these specific institutional features. Think about it this way. When a mathematician proves a Pythagorean theorem, are they biased toward right triangles? When a physicist explains why perpetual motion machines are impossible, are they anti-innovation? No, they're following logic to wherever it leads, regardless of whether the conclusion pleases anyone. Mises did the same thing. He started with undeniable axioms and followed the logic relentlessly. If that logic happens to demonstrate why socialist central planning cannot work, that's not bias, that's proof. Here's where it gets really interesting. Mises was actually critical of many pro-capitalist arguments. He rejected utilitarian defenses of freedom. He demolished crude, capitalism creates wealth arguments as insufficient. He even criticized many business leaders for their economic ignorance. Why? Because he wasn't trying to win political debates. He was trying to understand economic reality through rigorous logic. And rigorous logic sometimes contradicts popular pro-market arguments just as much as it contradicts socialism. In fact, if you actually read Human Action, not summaries, not quotes selected by advocates, but the actual systematic treatise, you'll find something surprising. Mises spends enormous effort analyzing phenomena like time preference, capital structure, and monetary theory in ways that have zero political implications. He's not making arguments. He's constructing a logical framework for understanding any economic system. The political implications come after the logical analysis, not before. Once you understand economic calculation, you can then evaluate whether specific institutional arrangements permit or prevent it. And yes, that analysis leads to uncomfortable conclusions about central planning, price controls, and monetary manipulation. But those conclusions follow from logic, not from preference. Notice how different this is from actual ideological thinking. An ideologue starts with markets good and dismisses any criticism. Mises started with humans act purposefully and went wherever the logic led, even when it contradicted popular free market rhetoric. You want to know the real test? Find an Austrian economist and ask them to defend a specific business practice or political position. If they're serious about praxeology, they won't do it. They'll analyze the economic principles involved, but they won't tell you, therefore you should support this policy. Because economics demonstrates logical necessities, it doesn't prescribe political preferences. The confusion happens because understanding economic law does change how you evaluate policies. Once you grasp that price controls create shortages necessarily, not occasionally, you can't support rent control with intellectual honesty. But that's not ideology. That's understanding cause and effect. So when someone dismisses Austrian economics as just pro-capitalism bias, you can now recognize the error. They confuse logical conclusions derived from economic analysis with political preferences derived from ideology. Mises proved things about economic systems. Whether you like those proofs is irrelevant to whether they're valid. Wait, you might be thinking, didn't you just say that Austrians don't use empirical methods? Now you're saying they don't reject empiricism completely? Which is it? This is where the third myth trips up even very intelligent people. They hear Austrians don't use mathematical models and conclude Austrians think math and data are useless. That's completely wrong, and confusion reveals a deep misunderstanding of what Mises was actually arguing. Here's the crucial distinction Mises made, and this is subtle, so stay with me. Economics itself, as a theoretical discipline understanding the logical structure of human action, cannot use mathematics or empirical testing. But economic history, the study of specific past events, absolutely requires data and empirical investigation. Think of it this way. Mathematics can't prove that humans act purposefully. That's an undeniable axiom of consciousness itself. But mathematics is essential for calculating how specific policies affected specific price levels in specific historical circumstances. The logic of human action isn't quantifiable. The results of human action absolutely are. Mises himself used extensive historical data throughout his work. When he analyzed the German hyperinflation of the 1920s, he wasn't just theorizing, he was examining real money supply data, real price movements, real policy decisions. When he discussed business cycles, he looked at actual historical patterns of boom and bust. But here's what he refused to do, and this is what confuses people. He refused to treat those historical observations as proof of economic theory. He used them as illustrations of principles that were already proven through logic. Why does this matter? Because empirical correlations in economics are always compatible with multiple theoretical explanations. You observe that increasing money supply correlates with rising prices. Does that prove the quantity theory of money? Or could some other causal mechanism be at work? Empirical data alone can never answer that question definitively, but logical proof can. When Mises demonstrates through praxeological reasoning that increasing the money supply, while goods remain constant, must necessarily reduce each unit's purchasing power, more units bidding on same goods equals lower value per unit. That's not a statistical correlation. That's a proven logical necessity. The historical data then illustrates what logic already proved had to occur. And mathematics? Mises didn't reject mathematics because he was enumerate or anti-intellectual. He rejected it because mathematics requires constants, and human action involves no constants. Every human choice is unique, contextual, based on subjective value rankings that can't be quantified into cardinal numbers. You can't mathematically model how much does John value apples versus oranges, because value isn't a quantity. It's a ranked preference that exists only in John's mind at the moment of choice. Mathematical economics tries to treat subjective values as if they were objective measurements. That's not rigorous. It's a category error dressed up in equations. But Mises absolutely used mathematics where it belongs, in quantifying objective exchange ratios, prices, calculating monetary magnitudes, measuring temporal relationships in production processes. These are legitimate uses of mathematics in economic history and applied economics. If this revelation about Austrian methodology impacts you as much as it does me, hit like so more people discover this precision in economic thinking that gets systematically obscured. The sophisticated position here isn't math bad, data bad. It's recognizing that different types of questions require different types of methods. Logic for understanding necessary relationships in human action. Mathematics for calculating quantifiable magnitudes. Empirical data for understanding historical circumstances. Each tool has its proper domain. When mainstream economists mock Austrians for rejecting mathematics, they're revealing they don't understand the epistemological argument at all. It's not a rejection of quantification. It's a recognition that you cannot mathematically model purposeful choice without destroying the very thing you're trying to understand. And when people claim Austrians ignore empirical evidence, they're confusing the role of evidence. Mises wasn't saying don't look at data. He was saying data can't prove logical necessities, but it can illustrate them and reveal specific historical circumstances. This is a more sophisticated, more rigorous epistemology than mainstream economics has ever achieved. It's not anti-empirical. It's epistemologically precise about what empiricism can and cannot accomplish when studying purposeful human action. Here's a myth that particularly frustrates me because it's so blatantly false yet so widely believed. Austrian business cycle theory has been empirically disproven or academically discredited. You'll hear this constantly. Modern economics moved beyond Austrian business cycle theory decades ago. The theory didn't predict the 2008 crisis. Empirical studies found no evidence for Austrian boom-bust patterns. Smart people who've never actually studied the theory repeat these claims because they trust their sources. Let me tell you what actually happened. And this is going to make you question how many other things you've been confidently wrong about. Austrian business cycle theory, developed by Mises and elaborated by Hayek, explains how central bank manipulation of interest rates creates unsustainable booms that inevitably lead to busts. Artificially low interest rates make long-term investments appear profitable when they're not actually sustainable given real savings. This creates malinvestment, resources allocated to projects that can't be completed once reality reasserts itself. The theory is pure praxeological logic. If interest rates are signals about capital availability, and you distort those signals through monetary expansion, you create false information that leads to systematic entrepreneurial error. This isn't prediction about timing or magnitude. It's a logical proof about causal mechanisms. Now here's what mainstream economists did with this theory. They created mathematical models attempting to capture Austrian business cycle theory in equations, tested those models against specific historical data, looking for precise numerical correlations, found that the models didn't perfectly predict crisis timing or magnitude, and declared the theory disproven. You see the problem? They tested a cartoon version of Austrian business cycle theory, using methods that fundamentally misunderstand what the theory claims. Austrian business cycle theory doesn't predict recession will occur in Q4 2024 with GDP decline of 3.2%. It explains the logical structure of how monetary distortion creates boom-bust patterns. The specific timing and severity depend on countless variables that aren't quantifiable into equations. But here's the really infuriating part. If you actually look at major economic crises of the last century, Austrian business cycle theory explains every single one with crystalline clarity. The 1920 stock bubble and Great Depression, artificially expanded credit followed by inevitable correction. The 2008 housing crisis, Fed created artificially low interest rates driving malinvestment into real estate. The dot-com bubble, same mechanism, different sector. In fact, Austrian economists did predict these crises while mainstream models saw nothing coming. Peter Schiff was mocked on CNBC in 2006 and 2007 for predicting the housing crash based explicitly on Austrian business cycle theory reasoning. He was exactly right. Mark Thornton published warnings about housing malinvestment using Austrian analysis. Right again. Meanwhile, Ben Bernanke, a mainstream economist who literally won the Nobel Prize, testified to Congress in 2007 that subprime mortgage problems were contained and wouldn't spread to the broader economy. Completely wrong. Why? Because mainstream models don't understand the capital structure distortions that Austrian business cycle theory explains. So how does the myth persist that Austrian business cycle theory is disproven? Through a combination of methodological ignorance and intellectual gatekeeping. Mainstream economics controls the journals, defines the standards for proof, and dismisses any theory that doesn't conform to their mathematical modeling approach. It's like rejecting geometry because geometric proofs don't involve statistical significance tests. The rejection reveals a critic's epistemological confusion, not any flaw in the theory itself. Here's what you need to understand. Austrian business cycle theory hasn't been disproven. It's been vindicated by every major crisis, while mainstream theories failed spectacularly. But those failures never count against mainstream economics because they control the narrative about what counts as valid economic analysis. Want the real test? Next time there's a boom driven by central bank credit expansion, and there will be, because they never learn, watch what happens. You'll see malinvestment in specific sectors wherever the cheap credit flows. You'll see unsustainable price increases. You'll see entrepreneurs making errors based on false interest rate signals. And when the correction comes, mainstream economists will be shocked while Austrians explain exactly why it was inevitable. The theory hasn't been disproven. It's been proven correct over and over while critics refuse to accept evidence that contradicts their preferred methods. That's not science. That's intellectual tribalism. The final myth is the most insidious because it sounds so reasonable. Sure, maybe Mises had interesting ideas about 20th century monetary policy and central planning, but Austrian economics can address modern challenges like cryptocurrency, climate change, artificial intelligence, or global supply chains. This myth succeeds by making you think Austrian economics is a historical artifact, relevant to its time, but outdated for our complex technological world. After all, Mises died in 1973. How could his framework address issues he never encountered? Here's what makes this myth so wrong. Praxeology doesn't analyze specific technologies or policies. It analyzes the logical structure of human action itself. And human action hasn't changed. The principles governing choice, scarcity, value, exchange, and coordination are identical whether you're trading goats in ancient Mesopotamia or Bitcoin in modern cyberspace. Let me demonstrate with cryptocurrency. Mainstream economists struggled to categorize Bitcoin. Is it money, a commodity, a security? They couldn't figure it out because their frameworks are based on institutional definitions and empirical patterns rather than logical first principles. Austrian analysis cuts right through the confusion. Money emerges spontaneously when one good becomes widely accepted as a medium of exchange. That's Mises' regression theorem. Money must evolve from a commodity that already had direct use value before becoming money. Bitcoin seems to violate this. It had no pre-monetary use value, which created a fascinating theoretical puzzle for Austrian economists. Rather than dismissing the question, Austrian theorists engaged it seriously. Some argued Bitcoin's use value was its network properties and cryptographic security. Others refined the regression theorem to account for digital scarcity. The point is, the same praxeological tools Mises used to analyze gold and paper money apply perfectly to analyzing cryptocurrency. The medium changes, the logical principles don't. Or take artificial intelligence and automation. People panic. AI will eliminate jobs. Mainstream economists create models trying to predict employment impacts. Austrian Economics has a different response. The logical structure of production hasn't changed. Capital goods, which AI is, don't destroy value. They shift production patterns. Technology doesn't eliminate the need for human purpose. It makes human purpose more effective. Mises' capital theory. Understanding how production processes unfold over time, how capital goods are complementary, how entrepreneurial calculation allocates resources, explains AI's economic role perfectly. Nothing about machine learning violates praxeological principles. The analysis is timeless. Climate change? Austrian Economics has crucial insights about why government environmental policies fail. Calculation problem. Central planners can't know optimal resource allocation, how property rights could address externalities, Coasian solutions rooted in Austrian property theory, and why market prices are essential for efficient resource use. The specific challenge is new. The analytical tools work perfectly. Global supply chains? Mises literally wrote the book on the international division of labor and why trade creates mutual benefit. Modern supply chains are just more complex versions of the same principle. Specialization increases productivity. COVID supply chain disruptions illustrated Austrian insights about how price controls and interventions disrupt coordination. You see the pattern? Austrian economics doesn't need updating for modern challenges because it's not about specific historical circumstances. It's about the logical structure that makes economic coordination possible or impossible regardless of technology level. The real question isn't, can Austrian economics address modern issues? It's, can any other approach match its analytical power from modern issues? And the answer is clearly no. Mainstream economics failed to predict the 2008 crisis, failed to understand cryptocurrency, failed to foresee supply chain fragility, and continues failing because it mistakes empirical correlations for logical understanding. When Mises developed praxeology, he wasn't creating a theory for the 1940s. He was identifying permanent logical necessities of human action. Those necessities don't change with technology. They can't. They're derived from what it means to be a conscious, purposeful being making choices under scarcity. So the next time someone says Austrian economics is outdated, you can recognize what's really being revealed. They don't understand that logical principles are timeless. Mathematical models become obsolete. Empirical patterns shift. But praxeological laws, like logical laws and mathematical theorems, remain valid forever because they're not contingent on circumstances. They're necessities of thought itself. Mises gave us tools for understanding any economic system in any technological context. That's not outdated. That's transcendent. You came into this video believing Austrian economics was something it's not, maybe fringe ideology, maybe outdated theory. maybe anti-empirical dogma. Now you see the truth behind those 5 myths that even smart people believe. This wasn't just correcting misunderstandings. This was revealing that an entire intellectual tradition has been systematically misrepresented. Mises developed a rigorous epistemological position about economic science that mainstream economics either can't understand or deliberately obscures. And that misrepresentation has consequences. Think about what you now know. Austrian Economics isn't anti-empirical. It's epistemologically sophisticated about what empiricism can and cannot prove regarding purposeful action. It's not pro-capitalism ideology. It's logical analysis that happens to demonstrate certain institutional requirements for economic rationality. It doesn't reject mathematics and data. It recognizes their proper domain, while refusing to misapply them to subjective value and purposeful choice. Austrian business cycle theory hasn't been disproven. It's been vindicated by every major crisis, while mainstream models failed spectacularly. And the approach isn't outdated for modern challenges. It's the only framework that offers timeless logical principles applicable to any economic context regardless of technology. The revelation here is profound. What you thought was economic fringe theory is actually the most rigorous approach to understanding economic reality that's ever been developed. And what you thought was mainstream scientific economics is actually riddled with epistemological confusion, mathematical pretension, and empirical fragility. Mises didn't create another school of economic thought competing for influence. He discovered the logical structure of human action itself and followed those discoveries wherever they led. That's not bias. That's intellectual courage of the highest order. Now you see Austrian economics in a completely different light, not as libertarian political advocacy, not as outdated 20th century theory, but as systematic praxeological analysis that reveals economic necessities through pure logic, combined with sophisticated historical understanding that shows those logical necessities playing out in every economic event that's ever occurred. This transformation in understanding matters because the next time economic crisis hits, the next time policymakers promise interventions will fix problems, the next time mainstream economists express surprise at predictable failures, you'll recognize what's really happening. You'll see the logical necessities they're violating, and you won't be fooled by their post hoc explanations and revised models. From now on, when you encounter economic analysis in news media, academic papers, policy debates, financial commentary, you'll be able to identify the methodological confusion that pervades mainstream thinking. You'll recognize when someone is treating subjective value as if it were objective quantity. You'll spot when empirical correlations are being passed off as causal proof. You'll see when mathematical models are obscuring rather than illuminating economic reality. In your own thinking about economic questions, you'll have Mises' framework. Start with undeniable axioms about human action. Deduce logical implications rigorously. Apply historical understanding to see those principles in context, and never mistake correlation for causation or statistical pattern for logical necessity. When someone tries to dismiss Austrian economics with one of these 5 myths, you'll know exactly what's wrong with their critique. You won't need to get defensive or political. You'll simply ask, have you actually read Mises' epistemological arguments? Because what you're describing isn't what the theory claims. You don't need to become an Austrian economist yourself. You just need to recognize intellectual rigor when you see it and intellectual confusion when that's what you're being sold. Understand the praxeological method clearly enough to evaluate whether economic claims are logically sound or merely statistically correlated. The Austrian framework gives you clarity in a world drowning in economic nonsense. Policy failures that shock mainstream economists will make perfect sense to you. Market dynamics that seem mysterious to mathematically minded modelers will be transparently logical to you. And interventionist promises that sound plausible to others will reveal their logical impossibility to you. That's not about politics. That's about thinking clearly using rigorous tools that actually correspond to the nature of what you're studying. Purposeful human action in conditions of scarcity. There's a passage from Mises I can't forget. Economics must not be relegated to classrooms and statistical offices, and must not be left to esoteric circles. It is a philosophy of human life and action, and concerns everybody and everything. It is the pith of civilization and of man's human existence. Do you feel the weight of that truth? Economics isn't technical expertise for specialists. It's understanding the logical structure of how human beings cooperate, coordinate, and create value together. And that understanding matters for everyone because economic ignorance leads to catastrophic policy failures that destroy prosperity and freedom. Imagine your life 6 months after truly grasping praxeological reasoning. You won't be perfect. Mises never promised perfect foresight about specific events, but you'll be intellectually grounded. You'll see through monetary manipulation with crystal clarity. You'll understand why interventionist policies produce opposite of intended results. And when the next crisis emerges, you'll know exactly why it was inevitable while others are shocked. This channel exists to discover together the wisdom of thinkers like Mises, intellectuals who had the courage to follow logic wherever it led, regardless of whether it pleased politicians, academics, or popular opinion. People who cared about truth more than consensus. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey of intellectual clarity. In the next video, we'll explore Mises' most controversial insight: why socialism cannot work even if everyone involved is perfectly benevolent and intelligent. It's an argument so devastating that even after the Soviet Union collapsed exactly as he predicted, mainstream academics still refuse to engage it honestly. See you there. And meanwhile, may truth set you free from the economic illusions that still bind most people.